All right, so we're diving into something pretty close to home for, I think, a lot of us.
Yeah.
Marriage.
Yeah.
Um, and specifically what it means to be a husband in today's world.
Right.
You sent over Conrad Reicher's book, Unfair Game.
Yeah.
And from what I'm seeing here, he doesn't really pull any punches.
Yeah, who doesn't?
He's really trying to lay bare the challenges that men face in marriage, particularly, I think, those of us who've, taken that red pill.
Absolutely. Yeah, you're picking up what Riker is putting down.
Yeah.
One of the first things that he tackles is this idea that traditional gender roles are some sort of outdated, oppressive system.
Right.
And he really argues that historically speaking, those roles emerged from necessity, from biology,
Yeah.
and actually worked pretty well for a long time.
It makes sense when you think about, like, hunter-gatherer ancestors and things like that. Men being physically stronger naturally took on these protector and provider roles.
Yeah.
And it wasn't about some kind of power grab.
Right.
It's just practical.
Exactly. And Riker argues that modern society is really trying to erase those differences.
Right.
Telling men that they need to be more like women emotionally.
Right.
While still expecting them to bring home the bacon.
Yeah.
So,
Talk about a recipe for confusion.
Big time recipe for confusion.
It's like mixed messages, and then guys are left feeling lost and unsure of where they fit in.
And that confusion can be really damaging.
Yeah.
Riker really highlights how this shift has led to a rise in emasculation, resentment, and even a sense of hopelessness for a lot of men. And he really connects this directly to the rise of anti-male sentiment that we see all around us.
And this is where it gets really interesting. And this is something I know a lot of guys in the red pill community talk about, is the financial side of marriage.
Oh, yeah.
Riker basically calls it a financial minefield.
Yeah.
Especially in a system that often seems stacked against men.
Yeah. He doesn't mince words at all.
Yeah.
He points to the pressure on men to be breadwinners, even when both partners work. Right. And the fact that divorce can be absolutely devastating financially for a lot of guys.
He uses some pretty stark examples too, right?
He does.
Like, I think there's a story about a guy named Steve who just got hammered in divorce court.
Oh, yeah, Steve's story.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a gut punch.
Ended up paying a ton in alimony and child support, even though I think the divorce was supposedly amicable.
Yeah, and it really illustrates his point about the family court system,
right,
often being biased against men. And he throws out a statistic that's pretty alarming.
Yeah.
77% of custody awards go to mothers.
Wow.
That right there tells you something about the uphill battle so many fathers are facing.
And it's not just some abstract legal issue, right? This is real-world consequences for guys impacting their finances, their relationships with their kids, everything.
Absolutely. And Riker is really warning us to be aware of the risks and take steps to protect ourselves. And I think that message resonates deeply with the red pill philosophy.
Totally. Yeah. It's about recognizing the game and learning how to play it strategically. So Riker talks about things like prenuptial agreements, keeping finances separate, practical steps that men can take to protect themselves.
For sure.
I'm curious, what are your thoughts on this? Do you think most guys are even aware of these risks going into marriage?
I think there's a growing awareness, thanks in part to communities like the Red Pill.
Yeah.
But there are still a lot of guys that go into marriage with blinders on.
Right.
And Riker's book is a wake-up call for sure.
Yeah.
And he doesn't just focus on the legal and financial stuff.
Right.
He gets into the psychological impact of all of this on men, and it's heavy stuff.
He doesn't shy away from the emotional toll at all.
No.
He talks about, feelings of emasculation, resentment, loss of identity.
Right.
Stuff that I think a lot of married men probably feel but don't talk about.
Exactly.
It's almost like there's this societal expectation for men to just suck it up and deal with it.
Right. And Riker argues that bottling up those emotions is incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
He highlights the lack of support for men facing these issues.
Yeah.
You know how society often expects them to be strong and silent?
Yeah.
Have you ever felt those pressures yourself?
Oh, absolutely. I think any man who's been in a serious relationship has probably felt those pressures at some point. It's like you're supposed to be the rock, the provider, the emotionless problem solver.
Right.
But then you get hit with all this societal messaging that's constantly questioning your masculinity and telling you to be more sensitive.
Yeah.
It's a tough spot to be in.
It is. And that's why I think Riker's book is so valuable.
Yeah.
He's giving a voice to these experiences, and I think that's incredibly important.
Riker also dives into this whole issue of legal discrimination against men, especially in family court. And he doesn't just throw out opinions. He cites some pretty damning statistics.
Right.
He says men are 3 times more likely to be ordered to pay alimony, and that 77% of custody awards go to mothers.
Yeah.
I mean, those numbers are hard to ignore.
You can't ignore those numbers, no. And he argues that those statistics reveal a systemic bias within the family court system.
Yeah.
And that it often operates on outdated assumptions about gender roles.
Right.
And he uses the case of Steve, who we talked about earlier, as an example of how fathers are often viewed as secondary parents and how that can negatively impact their relationship with their children.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. And I think it speaks to this larger societal narrative that often paints fathers as less important or less capable caregivers than mothers.
Exactly. And Riker's really trying to challenge that narrative to show how these societal forces have real-world consequences for men.
So what's the takeaway here?
Yeah.
Is Riker saying marriage is a trap?
Yeah.
That men should just avoid it altogether?
No, not necessarily. He does acknowledge that marriage can offer benefits.
Okay.
But he's urging men to be aware of the potential pitfalls.
Right.
To go into it with eyes wide open. You know, he's advocating for men to protect themselves legally and financially and to be prepared for the challenges that modern marriage can present.
Okay, so it's more about being informed and making strategic choices, not about avoiding marriage altogether.
Right. It's about understanding the game and playing it smart.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've talked about the erosion of traditional roles, the financial risks, the psychological impact, and the legal biases men face in marriage.
Right.
I mean, it's a lot to unpack.
It is.
And it definitely paints a pretty grim picture.
It does, and we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, really?
Riker goes even deeper, exploring the cultural climate and what he calls the war on masculinity.
Yeah, that's a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, but I'm curious to hear how he defines it.
Yeah, he's pretty clear about the societal forces at play. Welcome back. Let's dig into that historical context we're talking about.
Yeah.
I know a lot of guys in the red pill community find this stuff really eye-opening because it helps you understand how we got to where we are today.
Totally. It's like taking the red pill on the history of marriage itself.
You got it. Riker takes us way back, showing how marriage wasn't always this romanticized ideal we're often sold today.
Right.
For much of human history, it was primarily about economic stability, social alliances, and ensuring the continuation of the family line.
That makes sense. You know, back then, life was a lot more about survival, and marriage played a very practical role.
Exactly. And Riker points out that within this system, gender roles were pretty clearly defined.
Yeah.
Men were generally the providers and protectors, while women focused on child-rearing and managing the household.
Right.
It wasn't about one being superior to the other. It was a division of labor that made sense in that context.
He even goes back to, like, ancient legal codes, right?
Yeah.
Like the Code of Hammurabi or Roman law.
Yep. He uses those examples to show that historically marriage law was often quite patriarchal, reflecting the social norms of the time.
Right.
Men had more authority within the family, and divorce was much more difficult, especially for women.
It's almost like marriage was more of a legal contract back then.
Yeah.
With clearly defined roles and responsibilities.
That's a good way to put it. And Riker argues that this system, while far from perfect, provided a certain level of stability and predictability. Everyone knew where they stood, and there was a social framework that supported those roles.
Okay, so things were pretty different back then.
Yeah.
When did things start to shift? Was it the feminist movement?
That was definitely a major turning point.
Yeah.
Riker spends a good chunk of the book exploring the impact of feminism on marriage.
Okay.
And he makes some interesting observations. He acknowledges that the movement brought about important changes. Like greater legal and economic equality for women, which was long overdue.
Right. But he also argues that these changes had some unintended consequences for men.
He does. He argues that as women gained more rights and entered the workforce in greater numbers, the traditional roles within marriage started to break down.
Yeah.
And while this created opportunities for women, it also left men feeling uncertain about their place in the family structure.
It's like the rules of the game changed, but no one told the guys.
Exactly. And Riker argues that this uncertainty has led to a lot of the problems we see today.
Yeah.
Confusion about gender roles, increased conflict within marriages, and a sense of emasculation among men.
Okay, so the feminist movement was a catalyst for change.
Right.
But it wasn't the whole story.
Right.
Didn't he also talk about the influence of Marxism?
He did.
Okay.
He goes into how Marxist ideology, with its focus on class struggle and the abolition of traditional hierarchies, also played a role in shaping modern views on marriage. He argues that Marxist ideas infiltrated academia and the media, leading to the perception that traditional gender roles were oppressive and that marriage itself was a tool of capitalist patriarchy.
That's pretty radical. So he's saying these intellectual movements, feminism and Marxism, combined to create a climate where traditional marriage was seen as the enemy.
That's the gist of it. And he argues that this shift in thinking has had profound consequences, not just for marriage, but for society as a whole.
Okay, so we've got this historical backdrop, this changing social landscape. How does all this tie back to the red pill and the challenges men are facing in marriage today?
Well, Riker argues that the red pill perspective helps men see through the illusions that society often promotes about marriage. He says it allows them to understand the historical and ideological forces that have shaped the institution and to recognize the ways in which those forces can work against them.
So it's about seeing the bigger picture, understanding the context.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that the game has changed and that the old rules no longer apply. And it's about developing strategies to navigate this new landscape in a way that protects your interests and allows you to thrive.
He talks a lot about the importance of understanding and renegotiating the covert contract, right? Can you explain that a bit more?
Sure. Riker argues that in every marriage, there's an unspoken agreement between partners about how things are supposed to work. Who does what, who makes the decisions, what the expectations are. He calls this the covert contract because it's rarely discussed openly. But it governs a lot of the dynamics within the relationship.
So it's like the underlying operating system of the marriage, even though it's not written down anywhere.
Exactly. And Riker argues that a lot of times this covert contract gets established early on in the relationship, often based on traditional gender roles or societal expectations. But as the relationship evolves, those roles and expectations can change. And the covert contract can become outdated or even unfair.
Okay, so what happens when the covert contract becomes a problem?
That's when you start to see conflict, resentment, and a breakdown of communication. Riker argues that men often find themselves stuck in a covert contract that no longer serves them. They're expected to fulfill the traditional role of provider, but they're also expected to be emotionally sensitive and to share in all the domestic responsibilities.
So it's like a double bind, right?
Exactly.
Damned if you do, damned if you don't.
Exactly. And that's why Riker stresses the importance of recognizing and renegotiating the covert contract. He says men need to have open and honest conversations with their partners about what's working and what's not. And they need to be willing to adjust the terms of the agreement to better suit their needs.
That's a pretty bold move, though, right? I mean, how do you even start that conversation without things blowing up?
He offers some practical advice on that.
He
emphasizes the importance of approaching the conversation with empathy and respect, framing it as a desire to strengthen the relationship, not to attack your partner. He also stresses the importance of active listening. Trying to understand your partner's perspective and being willing to compromise.
So it's about being assertive, but also respectful and understanding.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that a healthy relationship requires ongoing communication and a willingness to adapt to changing needs and circumstances.
So I've got the historical context, the red pill perspective, and the importance of the covert contract. What other insights does Riker offer for men navigating marriage in today's world?
Well, he spends a good chunk of the book talking about the legal and financial realities of marriage, which we touched on earlier. He really hammers home the point that men need to protect themselves, especially when it comes to divorce.
He's a big advocate for prenuptial agreements, right?
Huge advocate. He sees them as an essential tool for safeguarding your assets and avoiding financial ruin in case of a divorce. He argues that prenups are not about distrust or lack of commitment. They're about being practical and protecting yourself from potential risks.
I think there's still a lot of stigma around prenups. People think it's unromantic or that it means you're not really committed to the relationship.
Riker addresses that head on. He argues that it's actually more responsible and loving to have those difficult conversations up front, to be transparent about your finances, and to establish clear agreements about what happens in case of a split. He says it can actually strengthen the foundation of the marriage by removing potential sources of conflict down the line.
So prenups are important. What else does he recommend?
He also talks about the importance of understanding your legal rights and responsibilities within a marriage, especially when it comes to things like property division, spousal support, and child custody.
Yeah.
He encourages men to educate themselves on the laws in their jurisdiction and to seek legal counsel if they have any questions or concerns.
He also mentions keeping finances separate, right?
He does.
Yeah.
He argues that while it's important to have shared financial goals and to work together as a team,
Right.
it's also wise to maintain a certain level of financial independence. This can help protect you in case of a divorce, and it can also give you more autonomy and control over your own finances.
Okay, so we've covered the legal and financial stuff.
Yeah.
What about the emotional side of things?
Yeah.
Does he offer any advice for men struggling with feelings of emasculation or resentment?
He does. He stresses the importance of self-care, both physical and mental. He encourages men to make time for themselves to pursue their passions and to build a strong support network of friends and mentors.
Okay.
He also talks about the importance of therapy as a safe space to work through those difficult emotions and develop healthier coping mechanisms.
He also talks about the importance of reclaiming masculinity.
He does.
What does he mean by that?
He's basically advocating for a return to traditional masculine virtues like strength, courage, stoicism, and leadership. He argues that these qualities have been demonized by modern society, but that they're essential for men's well-being and for a healthy society.
So it's about embracing those traits that are often seen as negative or outdated.
Exactly. He's saying that true masculinity is not about aggression or dominance.
Right.
It's about taking responsibility, being a protector and provider, and living with integrity.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
The historical context, the red pill perspective, the importance of the covert contract, the legal and financial realities, and the need for self-care and reclaiming masculinity.
It's a lot.
Is there anything else we should touch on before we move on?
There is one more thing that I think is super important.
Okay.
Building a strong male support network.
Okay, tell me more about that.
Riker argues that in today's world, men are often isolated. And lack the kind of close male bonds that were once commonplace. He talks about how men's groups, fraternities, and other male-centric organizations have declined in popularity. And how that's contributed to a sense of loneliness and disconnection among men.
Yeah, that resonates with me. It's like men are supposed to be these lone wolves figuring everything out on their own.
Exactly. And Riker argues that this is incredibly damaging. He says that men need a tribe, a group of guys they can trust and rely on for support, advice, and camaraderie. He emphasizes the importance of having a space where men can be themselves without judgment or pressure to conform to societal expectations.
So it's about finding your band of brothers.
Exactly. And he offers some practical advice on how to do that. He encourages men to seek out men's groups. Join a gym or martial arts class, or simply make an effort to connect with other men in their community. He stresses the importance of prioritizing these relationships and making time for regular social activities.
Okay, so building those strong male bonds is a key part of navigating this landscape.
Absolutely.
It sounds like Riker is really trying to give men a comprehensive toolkit for surviving and thriving in marriage and in life.
He is, and I think his insights are especially valuable for men who have taken the red pill.
Because they provide a framework for understanding the challenges we face and for developing strategies to overcome them.
All right, you've covered a lot of ground in this segment. I think we need to take a quick break, and then we'll come back and dive into some of the specific tactics Riker suggests for men who are feeling trapped or unhappy in their marriages.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so we're back, and I'm ready to kind of get into the nitty-gritty here. We've talked about the big picture stuff, the history, the red pill perspective, but I know a lot of guys listening are probably wondering, okay, that's all well and good. But what do I do if I'm already in a marriage that's not working? If I'm feeling trapped, resentful, or just plain unhappy?
You're right. That's where the rubber meets the road, and Riker doesn't shy away from these tough questions. In fact, he dedicates a significant portion of Unfair Game to providing practical advice for men who are in that exact situation.
Okay, so let's get tactical. What are some of the specific strategies he suggests? Well, the first thing he emphasizes is the importance of taking responsibility for your own happiness. He says that too often men get caught up in the blame game, focusing on what their wives are doing wrong or how society is failing them. But he argues that real change starts with looking inward and asking yourself, what can I do to improve my own situation?
So it's about taking ownership, not playing the victim.
Exactly. He's not saying you should ignore your partner's behavior or pretend that everything is fine.
Right.
But he is saying that you have more control over your own happiness than you might realize.
Okay, so what are some concrete steps men can take to reclaim that control?
Well, he talks a lot about the importance of self-improvement.
Okay.
He encourages men to focus on their physical health, their mental health, their careers, their finances, all the areas that contribute to a sense of well-being and self-esteem.
It's like that saying, the best revenge is a life well lived or something.
Exactly. And Riker argues that when you start focusing on yourself, on becoming the best version of yourself, a few things happen.
Okay.
First, you start feeling better about yourself.
Right.
Which naturally boosts your confidence and self-esteem.
Yeah.
Second, you become more attractive to your partner, both physically and emotionally.
Okay.
And third, you create more options for yourself. You're no longer dependent on your partner for your happiness or your sense of fulfillment.
Okay, that makes sense. So self-improvement is a big one. What else?
He also talks about the importance of setting boundaries.
Yeah.
This is something we touched on earlier, but it's worth repeating.
Oh, I do.
Riker argues that men often have a hard time saying no, whether it's to their wives, their bosses, or even their friends.
Right.
But he says that learning to set healthy boundaries is essential for protecting your time, your energy, and your sanity.
Yeah, I think a lot of guys, especially those of us raised with more traditional values, feel like we're supposed to be the yes man, always putting others' needs before our own.
Right. And Riker says that's a recipe for burnout and resentment. Yeah.
He encourages men to be more assertive, to clearly communicate their needs and limits, and to be willing to walk away from situations that are draining or disrespectful.
So it's about knowing your worth and not letting people walk all over you.
Exactly. He also talks about the importance of having a strong male support network. This is something we discussed earlier, but it's especially important for men who are feeling stuck or unhappy in their marriages.
Yeah, it's like having that group of guys who get it.
Right.
Who've been there, who can offer support and advice without judgment.
Exactly. And Riker stresses that these relationships can be a lifeline.
Yeah.
Providing a sense of camaraderie, belonging, and validation that you might not be getting at home.
Okay, so self-improvement, boundaries, and male support. Those are some solid pillars.
Yeah.
What about communication with your partner? Does Riker offer any guidance on how to have those tough conversations?
He does, and this is where the concept of the covert contract comes back into play.
Riker encourages men to sit down with their wives and have an open and honest conversation about the state of the relationship. He says it's important to express your needs and concerns clearly and respectfully, and to be willing to listen to your partner's perspective as well.
It sounds like a potential minefield, though.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you start that conversation without it turning into a massive fight?
He offers some practical tips on that.
Okay.
He suggests choosing a time when both of you are calm and relaxed,
right,
and framing the conversation as a desire to improve the relationship, not to attack or blame each other.
Okay.
He also stresses the importance of using I statements, focusing on your own feelings and needs rather than making accusations.
So it's about being assertive, but also respectful and solution-oriented.
Exactly. He also encourages men to be prepared for resistance.
Okay.
He says that often when men start asserting their needs and setting boundaries, their partners may push back or try to maintain the status quo.
Right.
But he says it's important to stand your ground and to be consistent in your communication.
So it's about holding the line and not caving into pressure.
Exactly. He also acknowledges that sometimes despite your best efforts, the relationship may be beyond repair.
Right.
And in those cases, he says it's okay to walk away.
Yeah, I think that's a tough one for a lot of guys to accept.
It is.
We're often taught to stick it out, to never give up, even when the relationship is clearly toxic.
Right. And Riker's saying that sometimes walking away is the healthiest and most loving thing you can do, both for yourself and for your partner.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. We've talked about self-improvement, setting boundaries, building a male support network, communicating with your partner, and even the possibility of walking away.
Yeah.
Is there anything else we should touch on before we wrap up?
I think it's worth reiterating that Riker's book is a call to action.
Right.
He's not just offering information. He's encouraging men to take charge of their lives and to create the kind of relationships and marriages they want.
So it's about empowerment, about taking the reins.
Exactly. He's saying that men have the power to change their own circumstances, to build fulfilling relationships, and to create a better future for themselves and for future generations.
That's a powerful message, and I think it's one that resonates deeply with the red pill philosophy.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing the realities of the world, understanding the game, and developing strategies to play it strategically and win?
Well, I think we've covered a lot of ground today. We've explored the challenges men face in marriage, delved into the history of the institution, and discussed practical strategies for navigating this complex landscape.
Absolutely. We've unpacked Riker's insights on everything, from the covert contract to the importance of self-improvement, setting boundaries, and building strong male bonds.
I know this has been a lot to take in, but I hope it's been valuable for you.
I hope so too. Knowledge is power, and the more you understand about the dynamics of marriage and relationships, the better equipped you'll be to create the kind of life you want.
If you're feeling lost or alone in this journey, remember that you're not alone. There's a growing community of men who are waking up, taking the red pill, and creating a better future for themselves and for future generations. Keep questioning, keep learning, and keep fighting for your own happiness.
Well said.
That's it for our deep dive into Conrad Riker's Unfair Game. Thanks for joining us.